Her name was erased from history, not exiled, not executed, not disappeared, erased. As if she had never breathed, as if her blood hadn't been real, as if every word spoken from her lips had dissolved into thin air without a trace. There were no more portraits of her, no letters, no birth records. Official chronicles spoke of a throne that was never contested, of an unbroken line of succession. But in the echo of the ruins, in that harsh wind that winds between broken stones, her voice can still be heard, like a buried lament, like a truth that refuses to die entirely. The dry whisper of the wind between broken stones seems to drag his memory along as if it still held fast, as if even oblivion had limits. Do you know what it means when no one ever remembers you? Imagine opening your eyes and not finding your reflection in any mirror in history. Imagine that every person who loved you was silenced, that your name became poison, that the stones you trod were lifted so no trace would remain, that the sentences in which you were once mentioned were rewritten, that when someone asks about you, they only receive an awkward silence or a memorized lie. That's what they did to her. For years, she was called the voice of the North, the white heiress, the daughter of wisdom. Her face adorned coins, her advice was sought by wise men, and her laughter, it was said, brought rain in times of drought. But one day, all that changed. In a single night, her name disappeared from the books. The walls were scraped, the statues were melted down, the songs were forbidden. No one was to speak of her, no one was to remember her, no one was to ask. And yet, someone did it. An old man who still whispers his story before he dies. A woman who swears she saw her in her dreams. A child playing among the rubble who finds a stone carved with initials that no longer exist. There are traces, there are echoes, there are cracks in the carefully constructed silence, and that wind that blows ceaselessly among the ruins seems to shout only one thing: she existed. But what crime can deserve absolute oblivion? Was it because I spoke too loudly in a men's council? Was it because she refused to marry the right ally? Or was it because he knew a truth that should have been kept buried? That's what no one says. Because to erase someone from history, it's not enough to destroy their things. You have to kill their memory and their hearts. You have to convince everyone else they were never there. And they succeeded. Almost. Almost. Because in the cracks of oblivion, she still breathes. Isolated, exiled, hidden, yes, but alive. Nameless, but with a soul. And she's not waiting for revenge. She's waiting, be found. And when it is, the world will have to remember everything it tried to forget. So, I repeat it to you. Do you know what it means when no one ever remembers you? Because she knows it, she lives it, and that's about to change. It was April 12th, 482, after the second eclipse. Midday fell like a burning curse upon the ruins of what had once been the heart of the empire. The sun, cruel and merciless, devoured the white stone of the fallen columns, making them glow like dead embers in the middle of a forgotten landscape. There were no shadows. There was no rest. Only the hum of the heat and the constant wailing of the wind. That wind whistled like a broken flute among the remains of ancient domes and collapsed temples, carrying with it the dust of the past, the kind no one dared to mention. In the distance, among the broken slabs and dismembered walls, the creaking of imperial mosaics could be heard, shattered beneath invisible feet. It was a subtle but relentless sound, as if the ghosts of the fallen were walking aimlessly, reminding the living that there was once a time when this place had a name, life, and power. And in the midst of that landscape of unburied death, a figure was slowly descending toward a dry well. Gray rags covered her body, and her face was hidden under a veil so worn it seemed part of the dust itself. Each step she took left a faint imprint, not on the earth, but on the history everyone believed was buried. Her movements were slow, almost ceremonial, as if each act were part of an invisible ritual that only she understood. No one called her, no one was waiting for her, no one was looking for her, because officially she did not exist. But there she was, breathing, living, remembering. In that empire, the most feared punishment wasn't death. Death could become martyrdom. The worst punishment was oblivion. For traitors of royal blood, there was no grave or public execution. They were condemned to absolute anonymity. They were stripped of their name, their history, and all ties to humanity. And then, they were cast to the periphery of the world, not to die, but so that no one would ever know they had lived. That was the fate reserved for Alara, not for betraying the Empire, but for knowing something that shouldn't be known, something that could shatter centuries of carefully told lies. That's why they erased her. That's why they threw her into that desert of stone and wind with no company but the echo of what she had been, but what nobody knew. The thing is, she still remembered everything, every word spoken in the mock trial, every face that looked down at the ground to avoid defending her, every step that led her to that exile. And the most dangerous thing, he remembered who he was, before of being forgotten. Alara hadn't died, not in body nor in spirit, and though she had no name in any book, she still held hers in the whispers she repeated to the wind, in the stones where she carved forbidden symbols, in the pieces of mosaic where she reconstructed her lineage with trembling but steady hands. But she wasn't alone. Although no one was looking for her, someone was coming, a man, a memory, an unpaid debt, a specter from his past who still carried his guilt like a rusty knife in his chest. And when their paths crossed, the wind would whistle differently, not as I regret, but as an omen, one that the Empire will not be able to ignore. Her name was Alara, or at least that's what she'd been called before history swallowed her up. That name no longer existed in any document, but she repeated it every morning like a spell, like a shield, in a low voice, barely a murmur. Alara, Alara, not so the world would hear her, but so she wouldn't forget herself. Alara always left a dried flower in the remains of the well where, in the past, the people would come to pray for rain. No one else did. No one else remembered that there, once, she had blessed a drought with her presence. "If no one names me, then I name myself every day," she used to say, tenderly crushing the withered petals between her fingers. He didn't talk to anyone, not because he didn't want to, but because there was no one left. He learned to survive with whatever he found. Roots that tasted like nothing, raindrops that trickled through cracks in the stone, and fires he managed to ignite with fragments of what had once been glorious columns. And yet, it wasn't the hunger that hurt the most. It was the silence, the absolute silence, the one that has no echo. That's why she sang, softly, very softly, ancient melodies that her mother sang while braiding her hair. She feared silence more than death. Because silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the affirmation that the world had decided to forget her. Have you ever felt invisible, even when you were alive? That you could scream in front of everyone, and no one would even look at you? That's what Alara felt every day. But everything changed when he saw it. He arrived as ghosts do, unannounced, without noise, just a silhouette in the midday mist, riding a tired, dusty horse. He was tall, bent under the weight of his years, or his guilt. His cloak was black, but not for style. It was sunburned, stained by paths that led nowhere, and he carried a knife slung across his chest, though he hardly had the strength to use it anymore. Kyle, that was his name, or that's what he called himself. He was a man without a flag, without faith, without a country. He had been many things: soldier, spy, thief, and perhaps, most importantly, verdugo. He kept his knife sharp, even though he hadn't used it in years, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to anymore. "I don't save anyone, but this time I couldn't look away," he would say later as he looked into her eyes and acknowledged what he had done. Because Kale knew her. He'd seen her before. Once, when she wore a crown and he followed orders. He was one of the men who escorted her into exile, one of those who remained silent when she begged for justice, one of those who lowered his gaze when she, chained, asked. Because, since then, he had not slept peacefully. He suffered nightmares about his face, with his voice, with the dried flower she left behind her before disappearing. And now he stood before her, not to save her, not at first, but to find something hidden, a fragment of history that could be sold to the highest bidder. But when he saw her, when he heard her soft singing, something broke, and for the first time in years, Kale didn't run away. He stayed. He listened to her, and inside began to remember too. What Alara didn't know is that Kale carried with him more than remorse. He was carrying the last piece of the puzzle, and what he was about to unearth wouldn't just change their lives. It could burn down the entire empire, because there are truths that not even eternal oblivion can hide, and they were about to face them. At first, it all seemed like just another assignment. Kyle wasn't looking for redemption. He was searching for an ancient relic hidden among the ruins. A map supposedly carved in stone, part of a cursed legacy that, according to black market whispers, could overthrow the ruling caste. He had followed clues, legends, and drunken old men to that forgotten corner of the world. When he arrived, he didn't think he would find life. The figure descending into the well barely caught his attention. He thought it was another beggar or a lonely madman. He didn't even bother to hide. He dismounted, walked over the remains of the royal mosaic without looking at the ground, and spat out a curse as his tongue felt dry from the heat. "I didn't come here to pray," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The woman raised her head. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She just looked at him, as if she already knew who he was, as if she'd been waiting for him for centuries. Kale felt a chill when he heard her voice. "Kale of the Seven," she said. "You've been a long time." He hadn't given his name. He wore no badges. There were no records left. But she knew him. His walk, his shadow, his debt. For a second, he thought about pulling out his knife, but his hands didn't respond. Not out of fear, but out of shame. "Who are you?" was all he managed to stammer out. She didn't respond. She just walked away, walking among the ruins, as if she expected him to follow her. And he did, without realizing it. As if an invisible force was pulling him toward the past he'd tried so hard to forget. Over the next few days, Kale tried to convince her that he was only there for the map, that he wasn't here to apologize or turn over graves. But she wasn't talking to him about the map. She was talking about the night she was condemned, of the faces that were there, of the lies woven like cloaks of justice. And the most disturbing thing, I knew things that no one else should know. "You didn't close your eyes when they took my crown," he told her one night, under the stars. "You were the only one who looked, and you still have them open." Kale began to doubt his motives. He began to stay longer than necessary. He repaired the roof of the cabin where she slept. He hunted a fox and shared the fire. And without knowing why, he stopped asking about the map. But then it happened. His horse disappeared. The footprints led north, and they weren't human. Something or someone had been watching them from afar. Ever since he'd arrived, the sandstorm was brutal. The sky turned red. The wind howled as if an ancient beast had awakened in the depths. Kale and Alara took refuge beneath a fallen vault, the place where she kept her life remains. Dried flowers, fragments of imperial symbols, children's drawings, and a stone block with a fire-sealed inscription. It was the map, not a road map, a map of lineages. One that proved that Alara was not only legitimate, she was the last living heir to the throne, and that document could ignite a civil war. "Why didn't you leave?" she asked, the storm raging in the background. Kyle didn't know what to answer, but it was too late, because they were not alone. That night, amid the roaring of the wind and the creaking of stones, a whistle was heard, then another, until a voice pierced the air. "In the name of the Empire, hand her over." A squad of Imperial soldiers had infiltrated the desert. They weren't looking for the relic. They weren't looking for gold. They came for Alara. Someone had discovered she was alive, and now they wanted to erase what time hadn't been able to. Kale took out his knife. He sharpened it, as always, but this time, not to defend themselves, but to protect her. And then, as the dust rose like a red mist, he discovered something that would change everything. She didn't want revenge. She wanted the world to remember the truth, and if he died trying, she wouldn't let him be forgotten. The sky was still reddened with dust. The wind never ceased, as if the desert itself were witnessing something forbidden. Through the earthy mist, the shadows of the soldiers loomed like faceless specters, approaching step by step with lowered spears and fixed eyes. They had been sent with a single order, to eliminate any trace of Alara, this time permanently. Kale gripped the handle of his knife until his knuckles turned white. He wasn't stupid. He knew he couldn't take them all on, but he didn't move. He didn't back down. Because this time, for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he was doing. Why was I fighting? The squadron advanced in close formation, as if still at an imperial ceremony. The commander, a man with a face weathered by time and armor marked by unsavory victories, stepped forward. Kale of the Seven. His voice was laced with a strange mix of contempt and disappointment. "I never thought I'd see you on this side. Are you really going to die for a shadow?" Kale responded in a firm voice without taking his eyes off. "It's not a shadow. It's everything you tried to bury, and she's alive." The commander signaled. The archers drew their bowstrings. The spears aligned, and at that moment, when it seemed the dust would swallow up the last breath of rebellion, Ilara stepped forward. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't carrying any weapons. He held only the carved stone block in his hands, the map of the bloodlines, the one that condemned them all. "Are you afraid of a woman without an army?" he said, his voice calm but firm. "Or are you afraid of the truth?" The commander frowned, as if the woman he had once seen chained had transformed into a force of nature. "Shoot!" he ordered. And then it happened. Kale launched himself at her, covering her with his body just as the first arrow flew. He didn't think, he just acted. A dry roar ripped through his chest. Ilara screamed, but it wasn't from fear. It was from rage, from loss, from memory. Kale fell to his knees, his hand still gripping the knife, but he didn't let go of the weapon. Blood oozed between his fingers, but not his eyes. His eyes remained open, fixed on hers. "Live," he said, barely a whisper through his teeth. "Live, so that they won't forget those of us who fell for you." And with that last word, his body collapsed. The soldiers hesitated. Some lowered their weapons. Others looked at the commander, waiting for the next order. But no one dared to advance, because at that moment, something had changed. They were no longer executing a traitor. They were facing the only truth the Empire could not silence. Ilara knelt beside Kale's body. She didn't cry. Not at that moment. She only whispered his name once, gently. "Kyle, of the seven, today your story begins." Then he took the block of stone with both hands, raised it to the sky, and with a sharp blow against a slab, he split it in two. Inside, he revealed a second fragment, a message engraved in the ancient language of the royal lineage, with names, dates, and a symbol that no impostor could forge. The symbol of the legitimate crown, the symbol that only she could carry. "I was erased," Ilara said, "but they remember me, and with that, they can't stop me anymore." The soldiers retreated. The commander, trembling, lowered his gaze, not out of respect, out of fear, because everyone knew it at that moment. The story wasn't over. It had just been silenced, and it had just been awakened with blood, fire, and truth. The desert wind calmed as evening fell, as if the earth had held its breath throughout the confrontation and could now, at last, exhale. The sunlight, once scorching, turned golden and warm, casting long shadows over the ruins. Kale's body lay motionless, covered by a cloth that Ilara tore from her own cloak. His blood still permeated the stone, like a sacred seal marking the rebirth of a history that should never have been erased. No one else dared to raise their voice. No soldier tried to stop her. She walked among them with her head held high, her feet firm, and the fragment of the royal lineage still in her hands. Deep down, Ilara didn't feel strong. She felt broken, hurt, racked with loss and guilt. But that was what drove her, knowing that her story, and Kale's, could no longer be silenced, because now they weren't just buried words. Now they had a martyr, a witness, a test. That night she lit a bonfire on the ruins of the well, where she had once been dragged in chains. There she burned the remains of the forged imperial documents, and over the ashes she placed the stone fragment carved with her name. No one else would write it for her, so she sculpted it herself, letter by letter, the Ara, not as a plea, as a declaration. As the fire sparkled under the stars, her voice once again sang that childhood melody. But this time, he didn't do it for fear of silence. This time he did it as an invocation, and although his voice trembled, each word carried the weight of a promise. This story taught me that forgetting isn't death, it's the weapon of cowards, and that sometimes all it takes is one person to remember, for everything to change. What would you have done? Would you have run away? Would you have remained silent? Or would you have stayed and fought, knowing that no one would speak your name? Because we all face moments like this, moments where we seem invisible, where the world wants us to feel like we don't matter, that our voice has no echo, that our story isn't worth telling. But every time someone dares to say, "Here I am," every time someone chooses to remember, even if it hurts, the empire of silence cracks a little more. And you too have a story that someone wants to keep quiet. Don't bury it. Ilara did not die that night, not even the next one. In fact, there began their war, one who fought not with swords, but with truth, with names, with memory. A war that is not over yet, because somewhere on the map, someone else is searching for the second part of the legacy. And there's something I haven't told you yet. Kyle, before falling, whispered something else. A phrase that Ilara barely managed to hear over the whistling of the wind. It's not just them. There are more, in the south. And that half-recorded track could mean that the Empire is not the only enemy.